Today on Delicious Ambitious, we travel to Cambridge University in England to meet Dr. Nancy Lane, a specialist in cell biology and a fellow of the Institute of Biology. Nancy has worked with the British government to help encourage young women working in science, engineering and technology. This led to the creation of the UK's Athena project for women in these fields, which Nancy now chairs. We started by asking Nancy to describe what she does.
I am a cell biologist at the University of Cambridge, and that's a kind of curious term. What it means is that I study the cells which make up organisms, not just humans, but every animal and plant on this planet. Well, it's very interesting. I always, as a child, was fascinated by how organisms worked and were constructed. Now, I grew up in Canada, and I lived in Nova Scotia, which was on the Atlantic coast. So as a child, swimming as one did, I saw lots and lots of starfish and sea urchins and snails and all these interesting, what we call invertebrates, animals without backbones. And I was always taking them and dissecting them and showing other little children, smaller than myself, how they were constructed and trying to figure it out myself. So in a sense, I always wanted to do something to do with, living creatures. Yes, I mean, I always felt that science had the great advantage that you would learn something about the way things worked, the way things function. You wouldn't be kind of making speculations. You'd actually be able to find out what the basis for something was. And since there were so many fascinating things going on in the world that, were biologically done, physiology, structure, activities, I think wanting to understand how that worked meant that I wanted to go into science. So I went into biology first of all and did a first degree in biology, and then went and did a master's degree in cell biology and then a PhD. Now the PhD that I did actually was at Oxford, and as a Canadian student I was very lucky to get a scholarship to go to Oxford. And there, of course, it's called a DPhil, but I worked on these animals, my beloved invertebrates, but I could do really interesting things with them because there was a fascinating machine called an electron microscope, which I learnt to use. And that, of course, gives you magnifications up into the millions, whereas the ordinary light microscope gives you only, about 1,000 times if you're lucky. So I could look into the heart of organisms and the heart of cells. Since organisms are made up of organs, which in turn are made up of cells, I could look into the heart of those cells, and it was fantastic. Because everything I looked at with the electron microscope, I knew I was the first person ever to see that particular structure, because nobody had looked at it before. It was very exciting.
So, how did Nancy end up working at Cambridge?
I went to Oxford and, of course, discovered the collegiate university system, which was amazing. And then, of course, if you're a scientist, you do a PhD, nearly always, if you want to carry on research, you do a postdoctoral research period. And I was very lucky and I got a postdoc in New York. And I was there for a year. And then I was offered a second postdoc at Yale University, which is in New Haven, quite close to New York. And Yale was one of the big Ivy League universities with a hugely prestigious profile, but also some extraordinarily able scientists. So having done these postdocs, these very able labs, I then was offered various other jobs. I was offered a job in Canada, in Toronto, and I was offered a job in Yale, but I was also offered a position in Cambridge. And since Oxford had been so wonderful as a collegiate university, I sort of thought, well, maybe Cambridge is going to be a bit like Oxford. And I loved Oxford. I was hugely happy there. And I loved the collegiate arrangement, and I loved Europe. I really adored London because I happen to love the theatre and the ballet and the opera. Well, I suppose the best bits about the work are when you're discovering something, when the experiments have gone well and you look and observe the data you've got and interpret it and realise that it's telling you something entirely new. Of course, doing the experiments are fun too. It's the kind of almost eureka moments when you suddenly realise the experiments have been properly devised and what you've got is an answer that people have been asking about or that nobody had known before, and you found this answer, which is great. Well, I discovered a structure in the tissues of invertebrates which had always been assumed not to be present. And it was a structure which had physiological importance. If you think about organisms having a blood-brain barrier, we all know that humans have blood-brain barriers, there's a particular structure called a tight junction which underpins that, is the structural basis, if you like, for a blood-brain barrier. And it turns out that some, if you like, sophisticated invertebrates have got a blood-brain barrier too. I mention in particular spiders and scorpions, which, if you think about it, have very elaborate and sophisticated behavior. If you think of the spider webs, they're so beautiful and so wonderful. There must be a very clever brain behind making those, and of course there is. And they have got a blood-brain barrier which is based on tight junctions of a slightly similar sort to the ones that we have. So in other words, there is a very interesting relationship between these high invertebrates, high in the sense of being highly evolved, and organisms which have backbones. And that was very exciting. Oh, I discovered that probably 10 years or so ago. And in fact, in a sense, I discovered that before I really went into what is now another chunk of my activities. So as well as being a scientist, I now am very involved with trying to make things better for women who want to be scientists or engineers. And a long time ago, when I was working, well, I suppose it was in the 90s, working with the Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister John Major, for the Citizens' Charter, there were some issues that came up about science, and when I asked him some questions about women's role, it emerged that they didn't know anything very much, and they reckoned ultimately that women were both undervalued and underutilised. And so that gave me a chance to actually chair a committee for the Cabinet Office, which they asked me to do. And we gave a report, and that resulted in a tiny little office in the DTI. And then things snowballed, and we persuaded the Higher Education Funding Council to give us some more support financially. And we set up a thing called the Athena Project, which I've been running. That started in '99. And that's been for all of women UK-wide in universities who are interested in science, trying to make the path easier for them, making it, as they say nowadays, a level playing field, and to make sure the universities really thought carefully about giving women an opportunity. The big problem, of course, for women is that they don't always make it to the top for a variety of reasons, not least the life of a woman is complicated by the fact that she's a childbearer.
What sort of challenges has Nancy faced in her career?
It's actually very interesting thinking about challenges. I think on the one hand, as a woman bearing children, and I have 2 children, it's a question of how much time you take off from the lab. I took off 3 months with each child, and that was very difficult because with young children you really want to spend time with them, and it's very tough, especially if you're breastfeeding and you want to carry on doing that. So I was cycling back and forth to my home, to the lab, and trying to maintain all of that. So it was tricky. However, having the children was wonderful, and I would never not have had the children. But of course, having the career was also wonderful. So it was fortunate that I was able, if you like, to juggle the two, because there was an appropriate leave and all these kinds of things, and family-friendly policies which were helpful. Now, they weren't as good then as they are, of course, now. So around that same time, I started up an initiative for Cambridge University, which we call WSETI, which is rather similar to Athena, only it's just localised to the University of Cambridge. Cambridge is a top university, many people argue, in terms of science. But of course, it's not top in terms of numbers of women who are professors, as indeed probably most people know. So we're very, very keen to try and get more women into senior positions, and the Society Initiative does that. So there have been some tough times with trying to establish in men's minds that women are just as good, and of course unconscious bias in many cases. Men are, well, they sort of imagine perhaps women can't do things as well as men because unconsciously they don't think of women as being in that same category really. So getting over that, I think, is really tough. And dealing with children, if you're a woman who wants to be a scientist and stuff, but you can do it. You can do it, and you can carry on and be successful as a scientist, which is great.
What does a typical day look like?
Well, it's very interesting, a typical day, because in a sense there isn't a typical day. If you're just doing a whole ream of experiments, which you might be at a particular time, then basically it's getting into the lab at the crack of dawn, setting up the experiment, doing the appropriate, in my case, preparations with the organisms and so on, and then carrying on the various steps of the experiment. But my experiments tend not to be ones that you do in a single day. In fact, they tend to run for several days. So one day I'll be doing that, the next day I'll be doing another aspect of the preparation to get these specimens ready for visualizing under the electron microscope, and then the next day might be looking with the electron microscope, and then another day might be taking the data that I collected from these wonderful photographs that one takes as an electron microscopist and analyzing them and working out exactly what things mean and how large they are and how small they are and what their arrangements are and so on. So in a way you do different things on different days because the complexity of different scientific fields is quite something. Now on some days, of course, I'm doing my work with women and I've got a meeting in London, say, or I'm going up to somewhere else to give a talk, or I'm doing something else, or having a luncheon. We often do lunches with an interesting discussion for women who are interested in science. And I also do things like having the undergraduate women that haven't made their minds up listen to women who are experts in the field talk about their careers, so that the girls can get some sense of what a career in science is like. And then they have Q&A and discussions afterwards and so on, which is great. No, it's very interesting. I never had a mentor. In fact, nowadays I'm very aware of the fact that mentoring is incredibly important. But there was no person who looked after me. I mean, no male nor female. There was nobody who sort of took me under their wing. And I now observe that people who do have such mentors it's actually hugely valuable, very, very valuable indeed. One of the things that I really am concerned about with the young women is the issue of confidence. You really have to be confident in yourself, because if you're not confident in yourself, then nobody else will think you can do anything. They say, oh, she doesn't know what she's doing, or she doesn't look as if she could handle it. And I don't think I realised when I was really young how important it was to pretend to be confident, even if you weren't. And, you could be the quivering jelly inside, but you have to have an exterior, or as I call it, a carapace, because that's a biological term for insects with an external exoskeleton. You have to have this carapace of confidence. And having established that, then people think, oh, well, this woman knows what she's talking about, then let's ask her to do X and Y. So I think I wasn't sufficiently confident. I think also I've been brought up to believe that as a woman, you always had to be polite, and you always had to be agreeable, and you must always do whatever people suggested you should do. I don't mean outrageous things, but I mean just to be polite and not hurt people's feelings. Well, I think probably in some cases you wouldn't want to hurt someone's feelings, but you've got to be assertive about what you can and can't do. Not for a minute do I mean aggressive. I just mean you have to stand up for yourself. And I think a lot of young women don't quite feel they can do that because they feel anxious. They don't have the confidence to stand up for themselves. So that's one thing I wish I'd known about. And the other thing is I wish I'd realised how important it was to be able to network.
What advice would Nancy give to young women thinking about a career in science?
That's a really interesting one. I think what's really important is to choose a field that you love. That's very tricky sometimes to know. So what you can nowadays do is to go into a lab for a short period of time. Some places, like Cambridge, enable you to take a fourth year when you do a little research project as part of your BA, which turns into an MA. And that way you can discover whether you like that particular subject. Some other labs allow you, if you're doing a PhD, to do 4 years, and the first year to go to different labs and get some sense of what they're doing. And the reason for that is that if you get in a lab doing something you don't really like much, either you drop out or else you keep on all your life doing something you don't really love. And you have to be passionate about science. I think you really need to love what you're doing. So I think that's really quite important. And this point I was making earlier about I would give them advice about making sure that they network properly and that they make sure that they've, something like a business card. Nobody who's a scientist ever has a business card, but actually it's kind of a good idea to have one. If you go to a meeting and you meet a bunch of people that you want to be able to keep in contact with, if you start scribbling your name down a bit of, raw end of paper and it'll be lost or they won't find it, a decent card will tell them who you are, what your email address is, where your lab is, and how they can reach you if they want to reach you by telephone. It's just a very useful thing to have.
And finally, what are the best bits about working in science?
Well, apart from the sheer excitement of the scientific work itself, disregarding that, which of course is huge, there's this thing about meeting people. People think, oh, scientists grubbing away in the lab all by themselves. Actually, you're not. You're always working in a team. And this team is usually a group of really interesting people. And increasingly, it's a global community. They're from all over the place. So you're meeting people from all over the world. So firstly, that's wonderful because it's very interesting. And secondly, it means you have chances to travel. So either you're going to do a collaboration with somebody who lives in India or South America, or could be Africa, or you're going to a conference there because your subject's having a conference, and so out you go. And essentially, if you're a scientist, you get to see the world. And what's more, you see the world having persons to welcome you wherever you're going. You don't just go and not know anybody. You go and there are people there to welcome you, to show you the way that particular country works, what homes are like, and it's amazing. I have been almost all over the world purely because of my science. And I often say, people used to say, join the Navy and see the world. I think it's become a scientist and see the world. I really do. It's a fantastic way of getting around.